Our first guest tonight is an award-winning human rights advocate, best-selling author, and highly acclaimed public speaker. She's also a medical doctor and the founder of War Child Canada and USA, which is an international humanitarian organization that over the past 2 decades has worked in conflict zones around the world to provide aid to hundreds of thousands of children and families in war-affected areas.
Dr. Samantha Nutt has worked at the front lines of many of the world's major war zones, from Iraq to Afghanistan, Somalia to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sierra Leone to Darfur, Sudan. For her distinguished service, she has been awarded the Orders of Canada and Ontario, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, named one of the 25 transformational Canadians by the Globe and Mail, featured as one of Canada's 5 leading activists by Time magazine, and recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum.
That is a staggering record of achievement. I'm out of breath.
I should probably go home now.
Well, you did it all.
So, what are you going to do in the next 50 years?
Yeah, no,
Nothing. I'm going to retire.
Yeah, well, before we talk about the next 50 years, let's go back to the beginning. So, you were born here in Toronto, in Scarborough, actually.
Scarborough General Hospital.
Scarborough General Hospital, and you went to Toronto French School and then later McMaster, but you also lived at various times and were educated abroad. Where did the international affairs, where was the inclination to follow that? Yeah, where did it come from?
You know, I was always interested in social justice issues, even even in my teens. And so for me, when I finally went to medical school, having done a degree that had I did a lot of work in human rights prior to that. And then I went to medical school and I was interested in the relationship between health and human rights. And so I just became more deeply enmeshed in that. And eventually that led me to do a master's degree at the London School. And from there I was recruited by UNICEF to work in war-torn Somalia. And it was that experience in particular during the famine that really had, I think, the most profound and even psychically shattering impact on me, and it certainly led me to where I am today.
Okay.
There are many humanitarian organizations around the world. What inspired you to start War Child in particular? Was there a need that was not being met at the time?
Jim, there absolutely was a need, and that was why we decided to create War Child. When I was working all around the world with UN agencies, with academic groups, with non-governmental organizations, and you would see a lot of organizations that were doing a wonderful job when it came to relief and emergency assistance. So short-term programs, food, water, shelter, blankets, vaccination programs, healthcare, that kind of thing. But as we know with war, it's rarely the case that it goes on for 1 or 2 years. I mean, look at the war in Syria, for example. We're now heading into the 6th year. Yeah. Wars in general last decades, and the impact of those wars go on for even longer than that. And so there was a critical need for an organization that was working in those gap areas, making sure that kids had the opportunity to get back into school, to get caught up on their education, so that they weren't facing this lifetime of poverty and despair, and in many cases as well, isolation, that they weren't being held back for generations. And so seeing that and seeing the need for an organization that focused on those long-term deficits, those structural challenges, and that also worked with those grassroots partners, that became the genesis of War Child. But in the process, we also tried to make sure that Canadians in particular thought differently about humanitarian aid, what works, what doesn't work, and for that we've had a long-standing relationship with music artists and the music industry to get our message out.
So it's far beyond just medical aid and assistance. It's a lot of things that families, children in particular, need to get.
Trying to give them back their lives.
Right.
Exactly, and it's not, in fact, we don't do medical aid. There are great organizations like MSF, the Doctors Without Borders, that do medical aid. I'm a public health specialist by training, so what we look at all of the needs on the ground, and we focus on 3 areas. Access to justice, so making sure that human rights are upheld and we're promoting the rule of law. We focus on economic opportunity, especially for young people. Youth, we know young people are driven to militia groups if they don't have other economic resources available to them, and for women as well. And then the third part of what we do, as I said, is education. So it's very holistic, and it helps families rebuild, recover, and reinvest in their communities to break that cycle.
So you were joined in this effort by your husband, Dr. Eric Hoskins. So both
yes, I recruited him. He's my first employee.
Ah, very good. Well, and he, of course, is currently Ontario's Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. You're both medical doctors, and you worked together for the better part of your early careers, doing very dangerous but very important work all over the world. What was it like living, working with your business partner and partner in life, especially when you face such danger together?
Well, on the one hand, it meant that we really understood each other. We understood what was driving this kind of, at times, dangerous work. And I think that was really important because it can be very, very difficult. It's very emotional.
You were almost
work.
shot
It's very
down,
tiring.
literally, a couple times.
We've had a few close calls. Yeah, I mean, we've been in car ambushes, in particular in Iraq. On a couple of occasions, we had to go through an evacuation from the Congo a few years ago when it was a very close call. So there is that close connection, that understanding, and of why we do what we do and what drives it. And it is wonderful to be able to share that aspect of your life with your partner. And it was great. I mean, the times that we were working at War Child together were fantastic. But you also, for the two of us, we want to make sure that we are always contributing and always helping to build safer, more just societies and environments. And so for Eric, that natural transition then was to provincial politics, and he's making an impact in a different way now.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, very much so.
Tell us about your book. This is it. It's called Damnations. Great provocative title.
Very good title.
Why did you write it, first of all, and how are foreign aid efforts affected in places where, as you put it, greed, guns, and armies prevail?
I wrote the book because, having worked overseas in war zones, in and out of war zones for the better part of 16 years, I saw what we were doing, what we were getting right. I saw the missed opportunities. I saw a lot of the mistakes that were being made, and I felt that I wanted to influence the conversation. I wanted to provide an opportunity for other people who haven't been going in and out of war zones to see some of the things that I have seen, and to meet some of the people that I have met who have inspired me, who have taught me. And some of those people, unfortunately, lost their lives in the process. But it was really about provoking a discussion, critical thinking when it comes to how we are often implicated in the suffering of other human beings, whether it is through the coltan that's in our cell phones, which is a mineral conducting element that's mined in eastern Congo that generates revenues for rebel armies and Congolese guerrilla groups and other mercenary groups, and contributes to the suffering of other human beings. Whether it's the investments that we hold that are deeply invested in, for example, teachers' pension funds, in arms manufacturers. We profit from war each and every single day, and the realities on the ground are absolutely heartbreaking. And so I wanted to help people understand some of those connections, but also what they can do about it. And that's why I wrote the book, and I think that it has had an impact in terms of how people see these issues and what they can do.
In the book, you use the term consumers of war. You basically say that we are all consumers of war, and you just kind of alluded to what you mean by that. But can you expand a little bit on that phrase, consumers of war?
Well, war is in absolutely everything that we do every single day. And as I mentioned, coltan, that's just one example. Coltan, tungsten, tin, copper, mineral resources that are mined in unstable environments such as the Eastern Congo that create revenues and fuel instability in other parts of the world. I mean, that is a conflict alone, Eastern Congo, formerly called Zaire. That is a conflict alone that has killed 5 million people over the past 16 years. It's the worst war in terms of the numbers of civilians killed since World War II. And roughly 60 to 80% of the world's coltan comes from the Eastern Congo. So whenever we reach for our cell phones, whenever we reach for our video game consoles or our computers, we are touching war. And we don't often see that or appreciate that. And unfortunately, we do profit from war every day.
So should we be more mindful of the products we buy? Is there a way of avoiding being consumers of war?
Well, I think that we need to be very critical of the purchases that we're making, the investments that we hold, and we need to ask ourselves whether it's ultimately worth that price, whether we are prepared to profit at the expense of someone else. And at the very least, I hope it would encourage us to see that international aid and development can and should matter to us, that we should be investing in it, because so often we hear, well, those problems on other parts of the world, they don't really have anything to do with me, they're so far removed, there's so much corruption, there's so much greed, nothing that we do will ever make a difference. And so we tend to focus our efforts almost exclusively locally, when their needs are enormous in other parts of the world, and we are implicated in those conflicts, and we should care about them, and we should also be taking steps to provide humanitarian relief.
You also argue in your book that one of the greatest impediments to peace is the fact that girls and women in these areas continue to be marginalized and subject to extreme violence. How do you explain the terrible and persistent violence against women in places like Nigeria, where the 200 schoolgirls were abducted by Boko Haram?
I think that, look, the violence against women is pervasive. It's in all parts of the world, and in some corners of the world it is worse than others, particularly when you're talking about countries that have a climate of impunity. A lot of post-conflict states where there are no really sort of functioning lawyers or judges or judicial processes that are in place. No consequences. And I've worked in some of the hardest areas for women. I've worked in Afghanistan, Eastern Congo, which is really, there's a rape pandemic that is taking place in Eastern Congo that has affected tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of young girls in particular. You know, rape, unfortunately, is a widely used instrument of war. And it is a way of demoralizing, intimidating, punishing, threatening, and scarring communities for generations. And at the same time, when we don't invest in those opportunities for young girls to rebuild their lives, to address their underlying physical and psychological needs, to really strengthen and uphold the rule of law, then that cycle just continues to play itself out. And I've seen the impact of really well thought out international development programs, even in hard places in the world, places like Afghanistan and Eastern Congo. But they take time. And so to get to that place where we're meaningfully reducing that violence against women, we do have to think differently about aid, because it is about so much more than writing a check and walking away and wondering why things don't seem to get any better. We're talking about interventions that take years, if not generations, to achieve.
Sam, let's turn to the Syrian crisis and Canada's response. Was welcoming, or is welcoming, 25,000 refugees to Toronto and other parts of Canada, was it the right approach? Should we be proud of what we've done, or would you have approached it a different way?
We need to be proud of what we've done. I think it was very important for Canada to accept Syrian refugees and to be demonstrating leadership around this. Now, whether we had to accept all 25,000 in 2 weeks, in 2 months, in 2 years, I mean, that's something that is certainly worthy of discussion. What we need to be sure of, and we've had really several years of cutbacks to local resettlement agencies and support groups. When refugees arrive here, they do need support, especially if they're coming from war-torn regions. They need a lot of help. They need a lot of health care. Their kids need to be integrated into the school system. And so we have to, it's not just about accepting refugees. It's about making sure that we put the resources into making sure that that transition is safe for them and smooth and as effective as it can be.
And are we doing that?
I think we have a long way to go still. I do. And our memories, unfortunately, are very short. And you know, they're going to need help not just this year, but next year and the year after and the year after. And I've spent a lot of time with, for example, the Somali diaspora here in Toronto, and they are 20 years into their time here in Toronto, and they're still struggling. And we need to get it right.
Yeah.
You've commented publicly and in your book about the need to revive diplomacy and dialogue and conversation as a way to resolve international conflicts. Do you think Canada will be more likely to engage in constructive diplomacy with Justin Trudeau as our Prime Minister?
I think that all signs point to yes.
Okay, that's the optimistic answer.
I'm optimistic. I think that we do have a government now that is prepared to reinvigorate our standing internationally, to re-engage in that kind of diplomacy that has a more sort of Pearsonian approach to foreign policy and foreign relations. And I've seen that over the last few years, particularly for me traveling internationally, you get a lot of groups that will turn around and say, well, I don't understand where Canada has been. Your priorities have shifted. Your aid is now so closely aligned with your trade agenda. You know, you used to be this beacon of hope around the world and opportunity and investments in human rights. And I think that our reputation has suffered a bit. And so I do hope that in the next few years we'll be able to reestablish that.
You know, even though that reputation, that sort of governmental reputation may have declined in the last few years, there are certainly an awful lot of Canadians, particularly wealthier Canadians, who have that Canadian
desire to go out.
The desire, but also the reputation to want to go out and help other countries. And we've seen actually the growth of what some people might cynically call humanitarian tourists, people who go with groups to third world countries and help to build houses and help in other ways. Are they misguided, do you think, or
would they be better off just giving aid to organizations like yours
that may be better equipped to help?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because as you may know, I have a whole chapter that's devoted to this in my book on volunteerism. I think most people have great intentions, and those good intentions are welcome. But it's really important to ask very hard questions of ourselves in terms of, is this the most effective way to contribute? And what's going to be the long-term impact of my efforts? Are they even sustainable? And what is happening on the ground? And could I be doing something that is potentially harmful? Because good intentions alone don't guarantee good outcomes. And Africa in particular is plagued by our misspent altruism. Right. And I'll give you an example. You know, hundreds of thousands of textile jobs in Africa that have been lost. That loss has been directly associated with the trade in used clothing originating from our side of the world. So if you're going to do it, ask yourselves those hard questions, because it might be more effective to just donate to a cause that's doing good work already.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. It's really been a pleasure talking to you, and you're doing incredible work.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back after the break with John Kent Harrison, the director of the latest TV movie adaptation of one of Canada's beloved literary characters, Anne of Green Gables.